So today I want to think about rules-based or principles-based approaches to guiding society. Now, there are kind of two schools of thought. Let's think about driving. I think in general, society would like there to be fewer accidents on the road. So we did things like create rules. We said, hey, if your blood alcohol is 0.08 or higher, you're not allowed to drive. Now, of course, we created this rule before there were cell phones. Now, it turns out that texting while driving is actually more dangerous than driving drunk. And it turns out that speaking on the phone, whether or not it's hands-free, is about as dangerous as driving drunk. But there's no rules for that, or there wasn't until recently, right? So a principles-based approach could say, look, it doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter if it exists now or it's unknown, you're not allowed to do something that impairs your driving. Now, these kinds of rules and regulations and principles apply to the accounting world, the regulation world, corporate governance, ethics, et cetera. I just wanted to think about these. So on the rules-based side, it's really very intuitive. They're like, it's very clear. Here are the rules. You can do this. You can't do this. Because of that, it's very easy to verify whether or not someone complied. It's very easy to enforce it. And you can change a rule pretty easily. You can add rules pretty easily. But there are problems too. For one, is like it's never going to be complete because things are always changing. Maybe you can't even keep up with it. So you're like, hey, this thing changed, and by the time you get the rule in place, it's already kind of irrelevant. There are situations where, in general, this rule makes sense, but in this particular situation, it doesn't. So it's not really adaptable to those types of things. And for me, the big thing is that it's possible to comply with the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. Hey, I followed the rules, but really, you got away with something you probably shouldn't have been doing. Now, the principles-based approach is a little bit different. It just says, look, we're going to give you a principle because we're saying it's not actually possible to list every possible eventuality. There are things that will happen. There are things in the future that we can't predict, et cetera. Because of this, it's able to cope with rapid changes, right? The changes happen, but the principle doesn't necessarily need to change. It allows for this subjectivity where you're saying, like, hey, in this situation, I think this is okay. Or in this situation, even though you're following the letter of the law, it's not really that okay. It definitely eliminates this box ticking or loophole type of thing where you're saying, like, hey, I did everything I was supposed to, but I managed to kind of sneak around and do this thing and kind of get away with something that I probably shouldn't have. But because of this subjectivity, it is oftentimes difficult to determine whether or not an entity complied, right? And there's also situations where maybe the same thing happens to two different entities, and they choose two different paths. And they both have some validity to them. They both kind of follow the principle in question. Now, this is something that is definitely part of the accounting dialogue. We've been saying for years that the U.S. would go to international accounting standards. I mean, 10 plus years ago, I was told this was imminent. Of course, GAAP is more rules-based, and the international accounting standards are more principles-based. Personally, as an analyst, I just want there to be one standard. I want to be able to compare a U.S. company to a company in France, and we can't really do that in a fair and reasonable way now because there are differences. So it makes it more challenging for us. Certainly, this is in the regulation debate. We have, in general, been moving towards more of a principles-based regulation. However, this is not necessarily true in all cases. I have, in fact, recently harped on the ESG rule. You can view my full analysis here. But in general, I think it's very specific to one type of investment. It's also, you can't do this no matter what. And in general, I think it is probably not a good regulation as written now. Of course, in corporate governance or ethics, the same type of debate can happen. Here's like a little cheeky cartoon that kind of harps on what I've been saying already, is that if you're able to follow the letter of the law but get away with a lot more than you should, in fact, you be able to kind of bilk your customers, but you follow the rules, then I think that's a problem. I think you need to think about that in this situation too. So, as an analyst, when you're looking at companies, you're evaluating regulations, whatever, I want you to think about these kind of two approaches. And really, I think ultimately we want a balanced approach. Certainly we want to have some guiding principles, maybe some rules, or at least some examples. Say, look, here's the principle. For example, you wouldn't allow this in this situation. We would allow this in this situation. Kind of guide us a little more. Ultimately, a balanced approach is there. But when you're thinking or evaluating company practices, regulations. Think about this. Think about how how effective it's going to be, and if it really moves us in the right directions. Thank you so much for listening.